chess, you need sufficient material to checkmate your opponent's king. If you don't have sufficient material, the game will end in a draw. The most basic example is to look at both sides with one king only. Neither side has sufficient material to checkmate their opponent's king, and so the game ends in a draw. Now, by adding a pawn to the board, all of a sudden there is sufficient material to checkmate the opponent's king, because if the pawn can reach the 8th rank, it can turn into a queen, and a queen is sufficient material to checkmate the opponent's king. Black does not have sufficient material to ever checkmate the opponent's king, and the best Black can hope for is to draw the game. And so in this position, Black would do everything they could to stop the pawn from coming up and promoting here to a queen on b8. Let's look at a few more examples of insufficient material. You cannot checkmate your opponent's king with a king and a bishop. You also cannot checkmate your opponent's king with just your own king and a knight. And not only can you not checkmate your opponent's king with one knight, but you cannot checkmate your opponent's king with 2 knights. Now that we know more about having sufficient material to checkmate the opponent's king, let's take a look at this position right here. From White's standpoint, White only has a king and a bishop, and there's no possibility for White to ever checkmate the opponent's king. The best White can hope for is a draw. From Black's standpoint, they know that they cannot lose the game. But they do have a pawn here on g6, which is pushing forward, that could potentially come to g1 and promote to a queen, or another piece. So if it's White's move, White should go ahead and exchange the bishop and the pawn here on g6. While the bishop is worth more points, the bishop's worth 3 points and the pawn is worth 1 point, the only thing that White's playing for is a draw. Since White cannot win, White should take away the only opportunity that Black has to win the game, and that is to push the pawn down the board. So in this case, White should go ahead and take the pawn here on g6, and the game would end in a draw because of insufficient material. In this position, although both sides have a king and can only move their king, the game is not a draw because there's still sufficient material on the board that could win the game. Each of these pawns could promote to the final rank and turn into a queen. From Black's standpoint, the goal is to come down, capture this pawn here on a2, and then promote the pawn here on a1. White's game plan is to capture the pawn here on a3 and then push the pawn up the board to a8. You can see that the king here on d5 definitely has the upper hand, as it's much closer to the pawn here on a2.
Who alive can't put me in a box. I redefine any definition you got. I am the tiger, I'm making steps to the top. The flames, I rip it up, you just gotta hand me the rock. Take a seat, you cannot stand it. All I know, the flow harder than a Scotch bonnet. Don't try to